Yeah, I'm going to talk about one of the projects I led at Open North, because it was a project that started at a hack day and grew to be this like high impact, low cost, and low maintenance project. And I'm sure that's like the ideal of any hack day project, that you don't need to spend your entire like career running it. So it lights up eventually. So that project is Represent, Civic Information API. So just to tell you quickly what this does, if we reload this page, oh no, internet. What's the Wi-Fi?
Architect Wi-Fi?
Yeah.
Oh no, not the guest.
No.
Architect Wi-Fi.
Okay.
And AT wireless key, all lowercase. AT wireless key, $1.
Cool.
There we go.
So the problem that Represent solves is you send an address or postal code, and then it tells you who represents you. So on this page, oh, it's already cached it. It determined my location, and it tells me that Bill Morneau is the Liberal MP, the MPP at Ontario level, the mayor, and the councillor. And it does this for every province, the Northwest Territories, and about 80 largest cities in Canada. And so finding out who represents you is a very simple use case, but it's mainly used by nonprofits, labor unions, and a host of other groups to run actions like this one, let's say, which is by the Dogwood Initiative. So they ran this campaign to have people sign, ask their municipalities to sign a pledge against the oil tanker traffic, which I believe is part of the Liberal platform as well. And as a result of that, I just called out and explaining that they were able to run this campaign, and which resulted in the passage of the most definitive resolution ever against oil tanker traffic. Just to give you a sense of what sort of activity this API supports. More recently in the federal election, Engineers Without Borders in the One campaign used this to bring the candidates' attention to the issue of poverty reduction. And as a result of this campaign, they have a quote here about having engaged about 20% of the incoming Liberal caucus, many of whom they had never had a connection with before. And so they had like real individuals, constituents for those candidates contact their MP or candidates who became an MP, and now that's like an entry point for these two organizations to continue to lobby for more attention on poverty reduction. And just one quick final example is this BC election guide by the Tyee, where they just use the boundary service that Represent offers to determine like which electoral district voters are in, and then give them some more of their own content around like specific issues for that riding. So to go back about to 2011, Michael Mully, who's the creator of OpenParliament.ca, and I ran this hack day where, like at this event, a bunch of people brought their own projects that they had worked on previous hack days. And for this hack day, we decided, okay, well, the last few times there were a bunch of people who didn't know what project to work on, who weren't like ready to commit to any of those longer term projects. And so we offered, well, let's have people like spend an hour or two writing a scraper to collect the contact information for all the elected officials in one province. And so that was a very like, it was a good project to have people quickly involved in, because it only takes a small amount of time to do it. It's very clear, like everyone understands, like I want to get the emails of these elected officials, and by the end of it, like you don't need to come back the following week. You could feel accomplished that you did this one thing. And so by the end of the day, we had all those elected officials scraped. And then the challenge was getting the electoral boundaries. And I forget if I said this earlier, but the reason I chose this project because it ties into a lot of lessons learned as well. Anyhow, for the boundaries, that was mainly like going to each provincial website, finding their data set, and in many cases at the time, emailing them in order to get it. And we also later found a volunteer to then email like the hundreds of other municipalities. And that was really our first strategy for getting this information. As it turns out, emailing governments does work when it's an easy data set like their electoral districts that they aren't terribly opposed to releasing. Although there were some cases at the municipal level where we had to submit a FOI request in order to get it. In one case, we had to appeal the decision, but we got it, and it wasn't terribly expensive. It just took a bit longer to go through that process. And so we had these two data sets, and now we had to make it available. And so the first lesson was stealing other people's code, which is, at the time, the Chicago Tribune had created this app where you submit a point and it tells you the boundary that matches it. And so we took that, put a lot more effort into it, and that was the first version of the Represent API. Along the way, another thing I should note about the scraping was that something that made it easier was that at the time there was this platform called ScraperWiki, which has pivoted since then and no longer really offers this service for free. But at the time, anyone could go to that website, and whether they wrote PHP, Node, Ruby, Python, Java, they could just write the code in the language that they prefer, and it would run on the schedule that you assign it, and it would output the information as a spreadsheet or via an API. And so all that like sysadmin work that you'd have to figure out otherwise was nicely handled by this platform. And so I know, and most Civic Tech projects need to scrape the information because it's not in a nice open data set. And so if you want to avoid a lot of the hassle of web scraping, the replacement for ScraperWiki is this morph.io platform. I'm not sure why there are sheep, but it's run by the Open SQLite Foundation, and they've improved on ScraperWiki since then. Now, after running this for a while and getting a whole bunch more scrapers, we got up to like over 100 scrapers running, all in these different languages because everyone was just running them in whatever they felt like. So obviously this was introducing a pretty significant maintenance burden. There was also the issue of municipalities changing their websites and scraper breaks, and so we need to write a new one. And so it was going to become quite costly to keep this project running. So a few strategies we used to get around that. One was to get the municipalities to adopt a common way of publishing it. And so we put up this page on our website, and then emailed the 60 or so municipalities that have open data. And we also provided this in a nice looking PDF so that they could print it out and share it, and it would look official. And after emailing people and reminding them a few times, we now have a third of all those data catalogs publishing using this simple specification. And there's a few reasons why that's worked. One is that elected officials don't change often, so they don't see it as a major investment of time. Like for many municipalities, people stay for the full term, and so they just need to worry about this once a year, once every 4 years. Another thing that helped is that at the time in Ontario, there's this group called the Public Sector Open Data, which is, I think most of the cities with open data in Ontario are members of it, and they were looking for things to standardize on, and so here was like an easy example that they could all get behind, and so we presented it to that group, and that got a lot of momentum for it. Another thing was that after we got a few, we started putting their logos on the page and just pointing people to this website, and they see like, oh, all my neighbors are doing it, was a pretty strong motivator as well. And so that's cut down the cost of running this by quite a lot. At the same time, I don't have a slide for this. We'll go here. There was increasing discussion within the Civic Tech community internationally about how we could work together better, because we recognize that we're all trying to build the same sorts of tools, and it seems a bit wasteful to constantly write new software when instead of potentially sharing software. So one of the groups where that took that conversation forward is Publis, at publis.org, and they have a pretty good mailing list as well. The idea there was to kind of make, say you're running a parliamentary monitoring website with like openparliament.ca that tracks the members, the bills, the votes, the speeches. If you try to do that all in one platform, you're not going to be able to take it from one jurisdiction to another. If you break it down in little pieces, then it becomes a lot more shareable. So the piece that we contributed to this was that boundary service that takes a point and returns the boundaries that match. And through that work, we ended up collaborating with the Sinai Foundation, which is the largest organization in this sector in the US, and with my society in the UK, which was one of the founders of Publis. And I'm gonna jump back. Publis started around 2013, 2014. And I'm gonna jump back to 2012 to tell another thread of the story, which is that around 2012 I was thinking, okay, I'd like to create a site that monitors the city and tells you like when a motion's coming up on the agenda, when the meetings are, those sorts of things. But I didn't want to solve it for just one city. I wanted to try to figure it out for a bunch of them. And so I started researching what standards were available for modeling people, modeling bills, modeling votes, and never ended up writing the software that would use any of this work. But through that, got into conversations with my society and Sunlight, who at the time had got pretty significant funding from Google to develop these reusable tools. And one of those tools that the Sunlight Foundation was working on was this sort of package for scraping data, then making it available via an API, and eventually building tools on top of that that would actually make it useful to the public. And so that framework for scraping eventually made it into Represent. And now, to give you a sense, like this, because the strategy of like getting all these people working together around standards obviously was a pretty long game, but we're finally seeing the outputs of some of that. So the most exciting is Councilmatic, which is some software that sits on top of that whole framework that the Sunlight Foundation came up with. And so if we go to Chicago, which was the second deployment of Councilmatic, they just make it a lot simpler for people to actually search the bills, figure out which ones are routine, which is the vast majority, and most of those are not interesting, and then the non-routine ones. So here you can see, like in the last month, hundreds of routine and 90 non-routine. And so this helps people sort out like what they should actually be paying attention to. I think the platform also lets you create email alerts based on keywords. Yeah, for instance, if I were to put in a keyword here, it can then subscribe to the list. And so one of the lessons that this part of the story kind of ties into is that you need to solve a lot of really boring problems so that people who come to hack nights can actually do something useful and productive. Like if you have this idea of, I want to analyze votes in the legislature and see who votes with other people consistently, you're going to have to spend, well, you would have had to spend a ridiculous amount of time collecting the data, making sure that the data was being collected regularly, not that over time it wouldn't conflict with the data that you already collected. Like so many of these important but really annoying problems. And solving all those tends to demotivate people, and so after you're working on the same problem for like 2 months, you've almost forgotten why you started doing it in the first place. And so after 4 years, we've solved a lot of those things with Represent, and that's how it's sort of got to the point where it is now. In terms of, so I'm jumping a bit around all over the place, but in terms of finding what's out there so that you could reuse it and not reinvent the wheel and like steal other people's code, one really useful blog is at openingparliament.org. And about once a month or every 2 months, they do this news brief where they just tell you everything that's been happening around the world. It covers both policy work by civil society, but also a lot of tech. And so if you want to track what's happening, I'd recommend following their blog. Associated to them is this PMO network Google group. And so if you search PMO network, you could just subscribe, and a lot of other information that may not make it into their blog posts is published here. I could share these links in the Slack later. But the last one that I think is really good, and I mean there are dozens of newsletters, mailing lists and newsletters, but I'm just going to say these three because they're the ones that I find cover the most, is this newsletter by Open Australia, which they email you, but I'm just showing the GitHub because this is where they actually edit it, and where you can subscribe. And so, I'm just going to remind myself quickly, what else? How am I doing for time?
5 minutes.
Okay. Without the questions, right? Still leaving time for that.
Yeah, we'll say 5 minutes.
Okay. I think I've covered a lot already. Yeah, so there's kind of 2 more points. I don't need the screen for this. So one of the things is that since we were trying to solve this for like 100 jurisdictions at once, it really forced us to figure out ways to be more efficient in ways that if we were just doing it for one jurisdiction, like we could put up with having to fix that scraper every week as it broke. But when you try to solve that problem across a lot of jurisdictions at once, you discover ways in which, like, the same effort that you put into that one jurisdiction, you could, by finding out those tricks, you could be just as efficient and cover a lot more. And so, I mean, what exactly those steps are will vary, but for Represent, part of that was getting the governments to actually publish the data that you want. Because I noticed a lot of times people run these civic tech projects and they spend a lot of time scraping, and they never even email the government to see if they just give it to you. And so, like, you could start on scraping, but at the same time email them just to see if it's going to work, right? And for Represent, like the reason we were using scrapers in the first place is that we wanted to have always timely information. But on occasion, if some organization really wants us to cover, say, like Grant County, like there was recently, which isn't like the most populous area, we enable some crowdsourcing aspect to that, and that we just give them a standard Google Sheet template. They fill that in with the information, and then it gets populated. And so that's another way to scale out when, like, someone wants you to extend your platform, get more data into it. Just give them the opportunity to do that quickly using tools that they're already familiar with. And I think yeah, I'll just talk a bit about some different ideas we worked through to try to fund this work, because although it doesn't take that much effort to maintain, still requires some funding. So our first idea was that we'd offer consulting around the API. So people would want to run an email campaign, and we'd integrate the API into their Drupal website or WordPress website. And we did a bit of that, but it turns out that there are a lot of people who do Drupal integration and WordPress integration, and that wasn't what we did. And we should just let them continue doing what they are doing very well. So the next thing we explored was whether the people who were using our API a lot would give us like a small amount per month. But as it turns out, a lot of those groups, they don't have don't already have a budget set aside for this sort of information, and so a lot of them said, well, we'd probably just go back to what we were doing before, which wasn't as good, but we just don't have the appetite to pay for this service. And so what we ended up landing on was finding a few of those larger foundations who do have the funding for it. So the David Suzuki Foundation has been very supportive. And some more exciting stuff that's been happening recently. So Google, working with My Society in the UK, used the information that My Society collected in order to populate all their candidate information for the UK election in the last year or two. And My Society was using like the data standard that we had come up with them and Sunlight, and so it was all kind of the same package of tools. So having heard that they were working with My Society, Open North got in touch with them, and we spent a lot of time talking about like how we could make this work, because Google's very sensitive about licensing and like who has copyright over the information that we're just scraping off websites. And in the end, they just went and used the data that the Media Consortium had, which lacked things like emails and photos and social media contacts, which we had, but didn't have as many licensing restrictions around it. They still use our data to validate the information. But having spent so much time talking to us, they also gave us a sponsorship in order to support the work that we were doing. And it's like those sorts of opportunities, finding like a large donation at once that's been supporting the work, in case you're curious, like how does this all work together. So yeah, I kind of wanted to touch on a lot of different things, because and a lot of things I talked about, I don't think many people knew they were doing, because it's really in the weeds, especially the stuff around standards. But hopefully it's got you thinking of a few questions or things you want to continue to chat about, and I'm happy to talk with all of you over the rest of the evening.
So we have time for a few questions. So if you have any, please raise your hand and we'll try to be brief if possible. Yes.
Quick question. Why not school boards, like the trustees?
I guess there hasn't been enough demand for it, but with demand, it would be possible to cover as well, yeah.